Luke, BJ needs the link.
Okay, I'll resend. Thank you.
And so we will go ahead and get started.
Okay.
Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. If you're not otherwise aware, you're at the August meeting of the Transportation and Environment Committee for Manhattan Community Board 5, where we hear issues related to the transportation and environment in the space that affect our district. This is our first meeting after coming back from our summer hiatus. We've got our MC for the evening and Zoom wrangler will be our colleague Luke Zabados from the Community Board 5 office. He will assist with any technical issues, as well as at points later in the meeting help to organize and report on questions that come in through the Q&A feature for when we open it up for any questions. Luke, do you have other technical issues to address before we get started?
Nope. We'll kind of outline how the public session will occur. We will be using question and answer feature at the bottom of the screen to help with that, because we expect a lot of people to attend tonight. But we'll go over that at a later point.
Thanks, Luke. So like I said, this is our August meeting of the Transportation Environment Committee. We have 3 items on our agenda tonight. They're all updates from the Department of Transportation, who's joining us here tonight. We'll be hearing updates on a couple different topics, including the status of the Open Streets and Restaurants program, which of course is ongoing. We'll be hearing updates and some follow-up information that we asked DOT to come back to us with regarding data and observations about the 14th Street Busway, which of course has been underway for many months at this point. And we'll hear an update on the ongoing Fifth Avenue improvements design process. So without further ado, we'll get started with the first of those items on the agenda, which is an update on Fifth Avenue and the design process, which I'll introduce briefly to provide some context for the members of the committee, and then I'll send it over to Ed Pinkar and the team from DOT to present what they've brought tonight. Just to provide a little bit of background, there are several elements of improving Fifth Avenue that we've heard about over the years, including a longstanding desire to continue to add to the city's interconnected bike lane network to improve cyclist and pedestrian safety. And to provide a little history, Community Board 5 is actually already on the record supporting the addition of a protected bike lane on Fifth Avenue. It's a position that I believe we adopted by resolution in 2017. Another component, obviously, relative to Fifth Avenue, which you might have heard about, is the busway, which the mayor announced earlier this summer to be installed at some point soon. That has been the subject of ongoing community advisory board meetings, or CAB meetings, being run by DOT in communication with the community to discuss and design whatever the rules and structure of a busway would be in dialogue with the community. There have been 2 of those meetings so far at this point, and there are still more to be had. So for that reason, for all those reasons, what I believe that we're going to see tonight from DOT, and I don't want to speak for them, but I believe what we're going to see is essentially an in-progress draft design by DOT as it attempts to address these multiple changes to Fifth Avenue, but in an eventually comprehensive way. But for reasons related to the fact that the busway design and conversations are still underway, which will be what we're going to see, I believe, is very much a work in progress. So for that reason, and to kind of set expectations for the committee, because the design we're seeing is not final, because the busway is actually still under discussion, and the rules and goals of it aren't finalized yet, and because Community Board 5 is frankly already on the record relative to the concept of a protected bike lane, and of course doesn't need to take a redundant position on that, I don't anticipate there being a vote or the taking of a position by the committee on this proposal this month, because it's still in development. DOT will certainly come back to us after the final CAB meeting relative to the busway, after continuing to design and discuss the rest of the Fifth Avenue development, and continuing to iterate on the kind of complete street design. So we expect DOT to return to us in the coming months, and I don't expect us to take a final position on this tonight. So I just wanted to set expectations for any action by the committee tonight, but we're looking forward to seeing the status update, asking questions from members of the committee and members of the district. And I'm sure that DOT is interested to hear our feedback as the design process continues and is ongoing. So with that, I will turn things over to DOT for the first presentation of the evening.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hi, Sam. It's nice to see you. Hi, Vicky, members of the committee and the board. My name is Ed Pinkar, and I'm DOT's Manhattan Borough Commissioner. I'm just returning from paternity leave. I thought that Wally Rubin was a handful, but being the new father of twins, I assure you they are a lot more difficult to deal with. But we certainly miss Wally already, and we wish him well on retirement. I'm joined by some wonderful colleagues tonight, Assistant Commissioner Janet Jenkins from our Transit Development Unit, Chelsea Gill-Games from her team, Sean Macias from our bike group, of course, Deputy Borough Commissioner Jennifer Santa-Ynez, Kimberly Rancourt, Colleen Chattergoon, and Jackie Lazaro from my office, as well as our great colleague Leah Flax from New York City Transit. We are really excited to present the committee with an update on the agency's thinking and plans for Fifth Avenue. As EJ mentioned, earlier in the summer, the mayor announced a series of busways throughout the city to really try to improve our mass transit system at a time during this crisis where more and more New Yorkers, especially those New Yorkers serving on the front lines, need greater access to transit and more reliable transit service. We were happy that Fifth Avenue was included in that plan, and we convened 2 community advisory board meetings thus far over the summer to start discussing what those improvements could look like. One of the things that we quickly heard from some of you, from our elected officials, and from other community stakeholders is that Fifth Avenue serves a variety of interests and needs, not only New Yorkers who work there, who live nearby, who commute through it, but also millions upon millions of tourists who come to this most iconic avenue each and every year, and hopefully they'll be back in mass pretty soon. We know that we need to improve how buses operate along Fifth Avenue, but we also heard loud and clear that we need to improve how Fifth Avenue functions for cyclists and for pedestrians, particularly at the holiday seasons. As EJ mentioned, this is something that Community Board 5 has long called for, a more complete street type treatment for Fifth Avenue, and has also been one of the requests from our elected officials. So at our second Community Advisory Board group meeting, we presented not only our initial ideas for how a busway could operate, but also the bones of a complete street for Fifth Avenue, including both needed pedestrian space as well as a protected bicycle lane. And we're excited tonight to run through that presentation to give you a sense of what we're thinking for the corridor as we look towards implementing a project later this fall. I think the key takeaways here are that we are trying, again, to balance all of the different needs for the corridor. We want to improve bus ridership, but also just transform how it operates for the millions of New Yorkers and tourists who use it. We are absolutely committed to hearing more feedback, which is why we're so happy to get on the agenda tonight. As the chair mentioned, we will reconvene the Community Advisory Board in the coming weeks as we continue our analysis of a lot of the wonderful feedback and great questions, some of them pointed, that we have heard thus far about how busway restrictions could work on Fifth Avenue. So we don't have any final decisions to share, but yes, stay tuned. Our hope is to reconvene that CAB in the next 2 or 3 weeks and then return to your committee, ideally on September 21st to give you an update. So as always, DOT is here. We never go away. We're with you every month. And we look forward to the conversations, getting some of your feedback tonight. Obviously, I personally, I hope that we get some good feedback on the complete street design. In 2017, along with a former member of Janet's team, we presented the double busway proposal. And I remember getting some pretty strong criticism from this committee and from a lot of members that it failed to include any pedestrian or cyclist improvements. We promised at the time that that would certainly be on our radar, and I'm happy personally that we're going to be able to show you some really cool ideas tonight. So with that, I'm going to ask Assistant Commissioner Janet Jenkins to run us through the presentation, and then of course, we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Chelsea Gill-James, who is our project manager for this project, is going to give the presentation interspersed with some of our colleagues from MTA and our bikes group, but I will be running the slideshow. So let me share my screen. Can everyone see that okay? Great. So Chelsea, to you.
Chelsea, I think you've been on mute. We haven't heard what you've been saying.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, I was just thanking Ed for the introduction again. I'm glad that we can be here this afternoon to talk a bit more about this project on Fifth Avenue. Great. So today's presentation will briefly review some background on the project. It will go over the complete street proposal for Fifth Avenue and conclude with next steps and a discussion. So the Better Buses restart plan was announced a month ago, highlighting the critical role that buses have played during the COVID pandemic and as the city adapts and reopens. Ridership numbers are still indicating that bus ridership has increased while subway ridership remains low. And this furthers the need to provide reliable transit service that prioritizes the bus, especially as we can anticipate people have a greater desire for alternatives to the subway, which will include a shift to buses, bikes, walking more, and private vehicles. Fifth Avenue is one of several Better Buses projects that's in development throughout the city. The project area will extend from 57th Street to 34th Street, which is a major commercial corridor and tourist destination. It's a critical connection point for numerous routes and for commuters from all across the city. There are high pedestrian and cyclist volumes, And with this multimodal use, there are accompanying safety needs and improvements that can be made. Additionally, this is an area where the community has many long-standing requests for transit improvement. There are 41 bus routes that currently run on 5th Avenue coming from all 5 boroughs. With so many routes, there can be 60 to 160 buses per hour throughout the day on 5th Avenue, increasing the importance that delays here have an impact on bus speed and reliability citywide. And with a focus on transit service reliability and Better Buses Restart program highlighting the critical roles that buses have played during the COVID-19 pandemic, I think it's important that we think about all of the city residents. As you can see in the highlighted light blue lines here on the map, there are numerous bus routes that connect at 5th Avenue and extend across the city, serving people in various demographic groups. Some of these factors like aging population or the number of people with disabilities are just a few of the factors accounted for in the CDC Social Vulnerability Index. And the Social Vulnerability Index is referring to the resilience of communities when confronted by external stressors on human health or natural and human-caused disasters. Again, we just include this to emphasize the role improvements on 5th Avenue has for the entire city and communities with limited options. To talk more about the daily bus riders who use 5th Avenue, I'm going to hand it over to a colleague at the MTA, Laura, who will share a few slides with you all.
Hi all, can you hear me? Okay, great. Hi, I'm Laura Azzi-Singh from New York City Transit. Just want to elaborate a bit on the bus service on 5th Avenue. As Chelsea pointed out, we have 41 of our bus routes coming from around the city and serving more than 100,000 customers a day. The breakdown in ridership is roughly half between riders on local Manhattan routes, such as the M1, M2, and M5, and the other half on express buses traveling to and from other boroughs. Next, Jana, please. Thanks. In 2018, the single bus lane that existed was expanded to a double bus lane, as you know. This led to an increase of up to 12% in local bus speeds and an increase of up to 20% for express buses, which is huge and really great for our customers. Next, please. Thanks, Janet. This past spring, during the height of the pandemic, the decreased traffic levels led to an increase in bus speeds on the 5th Avenue corridor. Speeds increasing 32% in the morning peak and up to 48% in the PM peak, which is really impressive and obviously helpful for our bus customers to get, to complete their journeys more quickly and reliably. I'm happy to answer any more questions about bus service if they come up, but with that, I think I can hand it back to Chelsea.
Thanks, Laura. Sure. Thanks. And all right, now continuing, we want to again acknowledge that there have been requests double bus lane was implemented with.
We're losing you a little bit. Can you say that again? Maybe you should turn off your video if we have to.
Yeah, sure. Is this a little bit more clear? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Yes, I was just saying that we wanted to acknowledge that there have been requests from the community as well. Ed and others have already acknowledged that we have received support from the community previously when the double bus lane was implemented in 2018, and that there have been longstanding requests for more of a complete street approach, including a protected bike lane in this midtown portion of 5th Avenue. And all the time we're making sure we're accommodating the high pedestrian volumes in this area, especially during the holiday season. And just to elaborate on the complete street approach, This approach provides safe and accessible options for all travel modes and people of all ages and abilities. There are multiple opportunities that present themselves on Fifth Avenue as we consider how critical it is to improve bus speeds and reliability, create more pedestrian space, safer conditions, adding a protected bike lane, and accommodating the vehicle pickups and drop-offs that take place in such a busy corridor. And also finding ways to incorporate beautification efforts with these opportunities. Ultimately, a complete streets approach also provides these safe and accessible options while supporting the city's Vision Zero initiative. As the numerous opportunities for Fifth Avenue are considered in a complete street approach, looking at the data that we have on hand, we can start with pedestrian volumes, where we see there are very high volumes on a typical weekday during peak AM hours. There can be up to 3,000 pedestrians per hour in this section of Fifth Avenue. And these are significant numbers for even the AM peak. But even in the PM peak, we see these numbers go up to 10,000 pedestrians per hour. And during major holidays, pedestrian counts go up to over 30,000 pedestrians per hour. These numbers can't be ignored, especially in our current crisis and as the city adjusts to a new normal for the foreseeable future. Additional pedestrian space is useful now in the short term for allowing people to safely socially distance, but also in the long term in anticipation of the pedestrian surges that we see during the holiday season. Another important travel pattern that's evident are the high bicycle volumes on Fifth Avenue. The number of cyclists on Fifth Avenue can exceed 2,500 cyclists on a nice weather day. However, there is currently not a bike lane on the corridor, despite it having the highest bike ridership on a Manhattan corridor. The current COVID-19 crisis also frames how many people are seeking transportation alternatives. Compared to the first half of last year, compared to the first half of last year to the first half of this year during the pandemic, bike crossings over the East River are up 6%. Again, a complete street approach will provide space to have a dedicated safe area for bikes during the city's recovery. And when looking at vehicle travel speeds, it's useful to think about what traffic typically would look like on Fifth Avenue, and also looking at where we are in the middle of this COVID-19 crisis as the city cautiously adapts and reopens. The yellow orangish trend line represents vehicular speeds using fall 2019 travel speeds on Fifth Avenue from 72nd Street to 34th Street. The blue bars represent travel speeds from early June of this year. The orange bars show speeds from July of this year, and the green bars show speeds from just last week. And a comparison of these dates show that yes, overall speeds increased significantly during the pandemic as traffic volumes dropped. But now we see, as recently as this most recent phase of the city's reopening, and as more things return, speeds are beginning to decline again. And if this trend continues, we are returning to what typical speeds were in October or in the fall of last year, which were as low as 5 miles per hour. And sorry, if you go back, Janet. And during critical morning, midday, and evening peaks, these numbers are continuing to decline. And it just calls for adjusting how this street is currently being used and preventing the less than ideal situation that we had before, but now for a variety of essential road uses. And finally, while we consider all of these options, we have safety information for this project area that shows recent data indicating high crash rates for all road users on this portion of Fifth Avenue, and this emphasizes the need for safety improvements. So now we'd like to present to the board a complete street proposal for Fifth Avenue. Just to catch everyone up on where we are since the mayor's announcement, starting with outreach and engagement, a community advisory board or a CAB, which is made up of elected officials, CB members, representatives of local institutions, property owners, transit advocates, and bus riders on Fifth Avenue. This CAB has been meeting regularly as this project is developed, implemented, and monitored. And there have been 2 CAB meetings to date, and the plan for the next meeting to take place is early September. We also presented an initial proposal to the CAB in July, which is what we are showing you today. And also, there was a walkthrough on Fifth Avenue with Commissioner Trottenberg in late July, so she is personally familiar with the corridor as well. The initial proposal limited southbound through movement to buses, bikes, and emergency vehicles, requiring all others to turn off before 57th Street, but still allowed local access for pickup and drop-offs, just that cars would have to make the next available turn off Fifth Avenue. Added pedestrian space, a protected bike lane, and a pickup and drop-off spaces were also features. The feedback that we received from the CAB included concerns about business needs, especially during the city's recovery, the ability to do direct pickups and drop-offs or southbound through travel, and also the amount of signage that would be required. We are continuing to evaluate this feedback and suggestions that we're receiving, and we'll be meeting with the CAB again next month. And even though we are still evaluating all of the possible traffic restrictions in this project area, we know we want to move forward with the safety elements, including the protected bike lane, expanded pedestrian space, and the pickup and drop-off zones. We will be returning to the CB in September, as well with any updates on proposed turn restrictions and a monitoring plan to make Fifth Avenue work as well as possible for buses, bikes, and pedestrians. The following cross-sections show how a complete street approach for all road users prioritizes safety elements. This typical mid-block cross-section shows maintaining the double bus lanes here along the west curb, a centered travel lane for all vehicles, a pickup and drop-off space for taxis and for hire vehicles, and a buffer between that pickup and drop-off space and a bike lane, protected bike, and a bike lane, which makes it a protected bike lane. Also, the east sidewalk will be expanded. And at this typical intersection cross-section, the design is pretty much the same. However, taxi pickup and drop-off zones would transition to a left turn lane where those left turns are permitted, and right turns can be made from the bus lane where permitted, as they are now. One of the proposed treatments that we just saw in the cross-section is a sidewalk extension. These painted curb extensions would create more space for pedestrians where volumes are high. Again, looking back at the pedestrian volumes, we know that this extra space can allow for better social distancing. Bollards or planters and other elements can be used to provide separation. And there are additional pedestrian safety benefits. At this point in the presentation, I'm going to hand it over to a representative from DOT's bike group to talk more about the protected bike lane as a treatment.
Thank you. This is Sean Macias from DOT's bicycle unit. Our proposal tonight includes a parking protected bike lane along the corridor. By providing dedicated space, we're able to boost safety and better organize the roadway to promote better interactions amongst all street users. This design also allows us to accommodate the increase in cycling associated with the expansion of City Bike, as well as the boost in cycling we've seen as New Yorkers start using their bikes during COVID-19. So it's a 6-foot bike lane, and then adjacent to the bike lane is a 3-foot buffer and then an 8-foot parking lane. This design accommodates people getting in and out of their cars to be able to open the door, pause, and cross the bike lane safely. Or if you're loading out of the back of your car, you're able to set things in the roadway, pause, and then find a gap across the bike lane and make your way to the sidewalk or the pedestrian space. Next slide, please. We did want to talk about interim designs tonight. In the early phases of project rollout, temporary materials could be used to provide some physical separation between vehicles and cars. We want to get the benefits to the street users, quickly. So we may put out some barrels, kind of like the photo here you see on your slide, to reclaim some of that space, right away. We are, because of the local law 45, mandated to wait, the local law, we're mandated to wait 45 days before we can start with permanent materials. So in that interim, we may put some barrels out there to try to reclaim some of this space. And then also on the back end, because we have to wait the 45 days, we likely won't get started until October. So we'll do our best to get as much as we can in, if not all of it in, by the end of the season. But any pieces that we don't finish, we will install temporary lanes to maintain that space over the winter until we can come back in the spring.
Thanks, Sean.
You got it.
Great. The next proposed treatment is creating space for pickups and drop-offs and what we're calling pickups and drop-off zones. We think these will be on almost every block. And the point is to provide space for taxis and other for hire vehicles to be able to pull over outside of the travel lane and maintain traffic flow. And last but not least, we are still looking at strategies to improve bus speeds and reliability. We want to make the existing double bus lanes on 5th Avenue work as well as possible. Some of the strategies that we're considering, cyclists that are currently using the bus lanes will be relocated to the new protected bike lane. Bus lane cameras can be used for enforcement, and of course we'll continue to monitor the use of the new pickup and drop-off zones, and also continue monitoring seasonal traffic, and if there needs to be any seasonal traffic restrictions on 5th Avenue. Again, all traffic restrictions are continuing to be evaluated. And sharing the ways we plan on monitoring this project, DOT will continue to track bus speeds, traffic flow, and travel time. We benefit from a monitoring system called Midtown in Motion, which captures traffic congestion and travel times. We'll continue to coordinate with our colleagues at the MTA, reviewing bus speeds and reliability data. And our plan is to provide more detail on monitoring thresholds when we meet again in September. As we begin to wrap up the presentation, I want to quickly summarize our next steps. DOT will discuss the details of the updated design with the cab in early September and return to the CB in late September. In the meantime, project information can be accessed at this website, newyorkcity.gov/bus projects. And there's also a project feedback portal, which can be accessed at this link. I'm not going to read it off, but when this presentation is posted on the previous website, you will have that link. Yeah, and the project timeline currently consists of ongoing outreach and stakeholder engagement, including meetings with you all and the CAB throughout this year and the next year. As mentioned, we continue to evaluate the various aspects we've presented and use this ongoing evaluation and meetings with you all to move forward. Thank you again, everyone, for your time. This concludes this presentation.
Thanks very much, Chelsea, and to the whole DOT team who participated. If you could just flip back to the timeline slide that we just saw a second ago, I just wanted to follow up and check. So as I understand it, there'll of course be at least one more CAB meeting while the design is still being developed and finalized, and the rules and goals of any eventual busway. Two questions. Number one, how many more CAB meetings do you anticipate before the finalization and installation of any new design? And then I can see that even after begin installing starts, there's an intention to do ongoing CAB meetings. Can you talk a little bit about what those follow-up meetings would consist of, and what sort of ongoing dialogue will be taking place with the community, like after installation even begins?
I can definitely take that. We over the summer heard again excellent feedback from not only CAB members, but our elected officials and property owners and other stakeholders. Some asked great questions, others put forward some suggestions related to the restrictions that we're currently analyzing. Our expectation is that we will be able to give a final update to the CAB with what we're proposing at the next meeting in early September, and then return to this committee on September 21st. Obviously, if that slips at all, my office will keep CB5 and other CAB members updated along the way. And then when we get to implementation, certainly depending on what goes in the ground when, we're always going to have some initial back and forth as we try to fight through that awkward construction period. And then we can discuss with the CAB at the next meeting what the most helpful schedule will be moving forward on providing updates. But my office attends the Transportation Committee meeting every month, and we're happy to provide updates along the way. If we need to do something more formal in terms of additional presentations, we're happy to do that too.
Great, thanks very much. So thank you for the presentation. With that, I will start by throwing it open to members of the committee to ask any questions that may have come up during the presentation. After that, we'll turn to members of the public who have been asking questions through the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we'll use that feature to compile those questions and kind of efficiently ask them to the DOT. But for the time being, Luke, what's the best way to do this with members of the committee? By raising hand?
Yes, please. You'll find the raise hand button in your participants panel. You're going to have to click participants. If you're having any challenge finding the raise hand button, board member or committee members, feel free to just unmute yourself.
So members of the committee, if you got any questions, feel free to raise hand. Joel, go ahead.
Just leading off what you were talking about before, EJM timing. will there be, what sort of time will there be for members of CB5, members of the CAB, and members of the public to give input between when the temporary improvements get installed and watching how they work up till the time that permanent improvements, which I think you said, Ed, will be in October or around October. So there's not a lot of time. Will there be opportunity for input after we see how it works?
So our preference, of course, would not be to install any interim materials. Obviously, the city's operations, DOT's operations, are really geared towards COVID recovery at the moment. It's a little bit of a different implementation season for us this fall than in regular years. We would, if we move forward with this design or a similar design, we of course want to go into paint and signage on the ground as quickly as possible. We just pointed out that due to all of the challenges we're currently facing, that we may have to consider some interim materials. Fingers crossed that that wouldn't be the case. But certainly, you know, any feedback that you guys get as a committee or even as individual members, please always send our way so that we can work with our colleagues to address them as best as we can.
Thanks. Just planning ahead to the public member session, would encourage members of the public who have a question to please review what has been asked in the Q&A, and instead of asking a second time a question that's already been asked, to use the thumbs up tool to plus up any question that you would like answered as well, to upvote it, as the kids say. Continuing with members of the committee, George.
Yes, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
This is our most famous avenue. Songs, Broadway shows have been written about it. It strikes me as a symbol of banality when you look at the pictures, that can't we do better? Have you looked at other cities around the world to see how they treat their busiest pedestrian street? A goodly number of them make the street completely car-free and emphasize the pedestrian aspect of the street. Has that been off the table from the beginning and is absolutely not to be considered?
George, thanks for your question as always. First of all, we started off not only this presentation, but the original idea for the project, understanding that Fifth Avenue is an iconic corridor that serves many different uses, not only all of the pedestrians who walk through the area, both on the avenue and the cross streets, 110,000 daily bus riders, and you know, it also is a essential retail corridor, an office corridor for Midtown Manhattan. We've heard some really good questions from the local stakeholders who feel that restricting private vehicular traffic at this time could really jeopardize the recovery from COVID. We've heard good questions about what impacts on the overall grid. So, you know, all options are certainly on the table. As I mentioned, we are analyzing what those restrictions could be and what they will be, and we expect and look forward to presenting the proposal back to you guys next month. So to answer your question, I think we don't think we can just shut down Fifth Avenue for pedestrians. It always needs to serve buses and emergency vehicles and local access as well. But we are seeing whether we're able to restrict more general traffic a little bit more stringently.
Thank you. Needless to say, I don't agree at all.
You rarely agree with me, George.
Wrong city, wrong country. What the heck?
All right, thanks for the question, George. Noah, I believe you have the next question.
Yes, hi. So when the 14th Street Busway was implemented, one of the big concerns was that taxis and Ubers and Lyfts and other TLC cabs, they were pretty much like almost scared to go onto a 14th Street because they were afraid of being fined or ticketed. And I guess, with the COVID situation, many people might be scared to take public transportation. So kind of what steps would you take to kind of make clear that taxis can, pick up and on this new corridor, to kind of make it more clear, so that they won't be scared to come and, serve these, this stretch of Fifth Avenue?
Sure, that's another great question. And we learned a lot from our experience with 14th Street in that respect. And certainly when we launched the 14th Street busway, it was not seamless in dealing with the taxi industry and some of the others, the trucking industry and other buses, non-MTA buses. We developed great relationships with Waze and Google Maps to try to help spread the word out on people's phones and on their navigation systems to better tell them what turns they could make, what they couldn't. We worked very closely with TLC to get information to drivers to explain what the restrictions were and what it meant for them, that yes, 14th Street was no longer a through street for taxis, but certainly along with Ubers and Lyfts and other for hire vehicles, they could make drop off and pickups. Fifth Avenue is a little bit of a different setup than 14th Street. I would like to wait until we finalize what vehicle restrictions we are pursuing before commenting on what steps we have to take to deal with TLC and others. But again, we have really good experience now based off of 14th Street, and I think we would be better prepared from day one and even before day one to address that concern.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
I'll also add, if I could, that some of those organizations are participating in the cab as well. So that's allowing us to get feedback from TLC and other organizations that are using the corridor in a variety of ways in a much more real-time basis.
Hugo.
He's muted.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. In regards to the overall grid, I can't remember, it was 50 something to 34th Street. So would the traffic have to be directed, let's say, regardless of buses, to 7th Avenue and Park Avenue? And have you done any concrete or explicit studies in regards to how traffic times would be affected, or how pedestrian density in those areas would be affected?
Sure, I'll let Janet and Chelsea speak to some of the traffic analysis for the overall network. Certainly, if we move forward with any restrictions at 57th Street, we would have many signs to the north encouraging motorists to find an alternative mode and it well in advance of 57th and 5th.
Okay.
We would get the word out to the mapping software companies so that they would take drivers on a different route from earlier on. And there are a lot of different ways, depending on where people are coming from and where they're going, that traffic would be able to find its way and still ensure local access. Janet, Chelsea, do you want to add to that?
I'll just add, I think you hit most of it, Ed, but as Chelsea touched on the Midtown in Motion system, we have the ability to kind of monitor traffic in real time, as well as working with MTA and all of the bus time data. So the whole part of the Better Buses Restart program was to allow us to implement projects before all of the traffic came back, so that we would be doing this monitoring instead of a lot of intense upfront studies like the kinds that we may have done on 14th Street. So that's where this monitoring comes in, and where if we end up a busway and those traffic restrictions are a pilot where we could actually study how those things are working as it goes along and make adjustments as we needed to.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
BJ.
I think Hugo asked the question that I was going to ask, so I'm covered. Thank you. It was about the traffic overflow because, you know, the cross streets, 57th Street is super busy, 42nd Street and 47th Street with the Diamond District and the 34th Street crosstown. So that I remember last year during the holiday, because of the number of no left turns, I mean, the Ubers and Lyfts had a horrendous time trying to pick up their customers or the delay because of the overflow traffic. So I am concerned about that as well, but Hugo already asked the question, so thank you.
Okay, thanks. For what it's worth, the second item on the agenda tonight is to get an update and learn a little bit more about some of the effects like that from 14th Street. It was a little bit of a Sophie's choice as to whether or not to do the get those numbers before we dug into Fifth Avenue here, but it will, I think, be useful to see what we learned from 14th Street and bring that, I think, to the next CAB meeting. Final call for any questions from the committee. Okay, with that, we'll take a look at the questions that have been submitted by the public via the Q&A feature. There's, of course, 108 people in attendance tonight, and we're all adapting our town hall format to Zoom for the first time. So ask you to bear with us, but we're going to try to take advantage of the Q&A feature here and prioritize the questions that have been upvoted by the most members of the public to try and efficiently answer the questions coming from the most individuals first, and we'll very much see how far we can get in what kind of efficient way. So if Luke doesn't object, I'll just start heading down the list of Q&A questions. Great. First question, why does the bike lane not connect to Central Park in the north and the protected bike lane on 25th Street in the south?
I can take that one. So we are aiming to create a connection north to the park as part of this plan, extending the bike lane north to 59th. And I think because we wanted to keep this project digestible, it ended at 34th, but the bike team will undertake a plan in spring over the winter and have something to present to the public, hopefully for spring 2021, to close the gap on the south side down to Madison Square Park.
And the other point here, we are dealing with some reduced capacity based off of COVID. The timing and the season is very late. We're doing some good work throughout Manhattan and the other boroughs now, but we certainly didn't have our full implementation season over the spring and summer, which really limited our capacity, unfortunately. But we hear from many stakeholders, including our elected officials, about that connection, and it's something we're working on.
Thanks. Next question. DOT is expected to come back next month with a final design. Wasn't the busway supposed to be installed this summer, and shouldn't something be implemented before traffic comes back? Do you just want to address timing on that and why it's happening when it is?
Sure. I mean, we are all feeling the urgency to try to improve buses and provide alternative modes as quickly as possible. We also recognize that there are stakeholders throughout this corridor and beyond who had legitimate questions and concerns, and it's certainly been beneficial to us and to our teams at DOT to be able to hear those questions and try to work through them to make sure that we are implementing the best possible proposal for Fifth Avenue. And I think the inclusion of a complete street plan is a worthy inclusion, and it's certainly taken some time to do some of that engineering, but it's going to lead to a better overall project.
Thanks. The next question, the temporary barrels on 2nd Avenue haven't been effective. They keep being moved until activists put them back. What have you learned from that, and how will you make sure that doesn't happen here as well with, I assume the implication is any temporary treatment that goes in?
Sure, and again, we certainly hope and pray not to have to use any interim materials here on Fifth Avenue or elsewhere for the other projects that we're considering in Manhattan. If we were to move forward, I think you would see a different type of treatment where the vertical delineation would be achieved through the flexible delineators as opposed to a series of barrels, precisely because of the challenges that the question describes. So yes, we've learned a lot since we put out the initial barrels over the summer, and I think we would do a different treatment here, if necessary.
Okay, the next question. Protected bike lanes and bus lanes would increase the number of people going through the area who might stop into oh, I'm sorry. This appears to have been some kind of discussion that was happening. They are not, as far as I can tell, questions for the presenters. The bus speeds that were mentioned in the spring 2020 are impressive. Shouldn't the city be doing more to prevent private car traffic into the central business district? Are we going to be sure that congestion pricing gets implemented on schedule?
I can't speak to the schedule for congestion pricing. Obviously, I know the MTA and TBTA are working diligently on that, and whatever happens with the federal government is going to happen. I do think that we're absolutely looking at ways to improve bus service throughout the city. We have a series of proposals, not only on Fifth Avenue, 181st Street, also in Manhattan, and we're working through that process.
Next question is also about orange barrels. Orange barrels are not protection and are easily moved or rammed by drivers. What is preventing DOT from dropping, I guess, more solid barriers to provide real protection at dangerous intersections instead of orange barrels?
So one of the big constraints that we have whenever we pursue street design treatments is we need to make sure the streets themselves can be maintained, that they are not only so DOT's crews can perform necessary work, utilities can work underground, the sanitation department can both sweep the streets of garbage as well as clear them of snow. So we are definitely, as an agency, exploring a variety of different treatments. But in general, it's tough to just throw out, say, larger barriers within the roadway if we don't have the space. So even here, the ped and the bike space would be large enough for a sanitation vehicle, as an example, to continue to access the area. We do think that the delineation and the inclusion of green paint will certainly make the area very visible as pedestrian and cyclist space. But yes, we understand that there's a desire for even greater protection for these types of treatments, and it's something that as an agency we're working on.
I think the next question is also very similar to that one. Why use only a painted pedestrian space instead of planters or extending the sidewalk into the street relative to materials?
So again, planters is something that we might be able to consider either, if not immediately, over time. In terms of building out the sidewalk, that's always the longer term preference. And it just requires a capital project in order to relocate utilities, catch basins, signal infrastructure. It's just much more involved and would not be able to happen at any speed. We also know that the COVID has greatly impacted the city's budget, whereas we're able through paint and signage and delineators to move forward pretty quickly with tactical urbanism that shows us how the changes will work before we pursue the longer term, more permanent capital improvements.
Great, thanks, Ed. And I just want to say to members of the public, thanks very much for rolling with us as we try this new system, as opposed to all being in a room together and going around the room. Appreciate your cooperation as much as possible, and we'll continue to prioritize the questions that seem to have the most upvotes. That having been said, please try very hard not to repeat any questions that have already been asked. I'm going to try very hard to make a judgment call to make sure we keep moving as efficiently as possible instead of repeating ourselves. And it goes without saying, Ed and DOT, thank you for answering all the questions from both the committee and the members of the public. It's much appreciated. Next question is, Fifth Avenue is the most productive urban retail district in the Americas, and many customers arrive and leave using private transportation to carry purchased items. Eliminating through traffic will have a negative impact on overall traffic to this critical piece of the economy. What consideration has gone into protecting the business district and keeping the heaviest pedestrian traffic retail district in the country safe? I believe it's a question relative to protecting businesses and the economic impact on the neighborhood, while at the same time protecting safety.
Yes, I mean, obviously, for pedestrians, we feel that by providing additional painted space initially, that can only be a benefit for the millions of pedestrians who walk through the area. It'll help just change the face of it, as well as its function. One of the real concerns that we've heard from stakeholders thus far about a busway with private vehicle restrictions is its impact on retail, in particular during COVID recovery, and that is something that is being looked at very carefully, and we expect to be able to provide some responses to the CAB and then ultimately the community board next month.
Great, thanks, Ed. The next question is related to the CAB. Does the CAB only engage with community boards in the build area, like CB5, or is it engaging with every community board that would have bus experiences improved by the change? So, is every community board that has a bus that runs on Fifth Avenue included in the CAB?
No, not every community board is included. We certainly are aware that many of the bus riders along Fifth Avenue are coming from outside of Manhattan even. And, I think between our elected officials and some of the advocates who serve on the CAB, those bus riders are very well represented, but we're happy to take any question, comment, feedback, complaint from different community boards or residents throughout the city.
Thanks, Ed. Luke, I believe you had something to say about the process here.
Yeah, if, as you see, we have 28 open questions. If anybody, I think panelists should be able to answer these live. If anybody from DOT or MTA can identify questions that can be answered, feel free to type in answers. Everybody will be able to see them.
Thanks, Luke. That's very helpful and a great way to get more questions answered while being respectful of everyone's time. The next question is asking for a numeric breakdown. How many cars passing through Fifth Avenue are through traffic versus how much is destination traffic? That's a pretty good question. I'm curious about that.
Janet, Chelsea, can you talk a little bit about some of the traffic volumes?
Yeah, I mean, I will say this is going specifically at how many vehicles are going through versus stopping. We are looking to see if we can figure out information about that. That's a really hard thing to understand. We do have a sense of where the most taxi pickup and drop-offs happen, for example, which is really good information. And we are analyzing some of the data from one of our data partners called Streetlight about how vehicles move along the corridor, and that's helping us inform some of the traffic restriction ideas that we're evaluating. So we're still working on that.
EJ, it said, I'm gonna have to just jump off. I'm not sure if you hear some of the symphony coming from the other room, but obviously Janet and Jennifer and Kimberly and others are gonna remain online to answer any of your questions. I just wanted to thank everybody for their time tonight and certainly commit to being in touch soon as we move forward with this very exciting proposal.
Thank you, Ed. Thanks for being here. You can go back to your 3-month-old constituencies.
Thanks, guys. Good night.
I'm going to paraphrase this next question because it's a little bit long. The bike lane runs through one of the world's retail destinations. Surely you should widen sidewalks before allowing bike lanes down the avenue to cause more accidents between bikes, as shown in recent side street bike lanes and increase accidents there. This seems to not take into account the need to encourage the return of the avenue and its businesses to the retail flagship section of New York. Could you talk a little, addressing this, could you talk a little bit about whether or not sidewalks are widened as part of this plan and why the bike lane is going into Fifth Avenue and not the side avenues?
Sean can elaborate on this if he has more to add, but essentially we are proposing to widen the sidewalk on the east side where feasible, adjacent to the bike lane. So it is taking into account the needs of pedestrians as well as cyclists. And as Sean mentioned, or as Chelsea mentioned, we have thousands of cyclists using this corridor, and we've had requests from elected officials and the community board to add space for cyclists. So that is a priority on this corridor.
Okay, thanks.
Not sure if there was more to the question. You can ask again.
The next question is, as a cyclist, I'm concerned about the interim bike lane materials used. And again, this is about barrels being dangerous, but the question is specific to why can't we use Yodocs, which are at once slim and a good impact attenuator, or failing that, Jersey barriers. Do you want to expand on the earlier answer of space? Or is that?
Sure. I mean, I think in general, I think we do understand that the barrels haven't been working out as well as we might have liked, and that they're very challenging. So, which is why we are looking to use delineators instead. I don't know if Sean is still on, but I think Ed kind of touched on the other reasons for not using other materials earlier. But we have learned from, our experiences with the initial temporary bike lanes that the barrels really are a challenge to maintain. And so we're looking at the delineators instead.
Great, thank
Right,
you.
and I'm still here, Kim. And the goal is to try to get this in this year. So I think the interim materials would be, in case we didn't finish everything, although that is the goal. And what we have learned is that we go to materials that don't shift around like those barrels currently do, and we share your frustration.
The next question I think is related to busway rules. Will people shopping along the corridor via private car be able to go to one store and then go to another block? This is not through traffic, correct? I think it's related to driving from one block to the next block.
Right. The initial proposal for the busway would require everyone to make the next turn off of the corridor. So you can get to your destination, but you would then have to turn off the corridor. But like we said, we are still really considering what the options are for traffic restrictions on the corridor, but that is how it would work if those restrictions move forward.
Okay, thank you. Will or is signal timing adjusted to 25 miles an hour? There is a fear of express buses going too fast. Are there other ways to monitor the speed of express buses?
I don't know if anyone from MTA wants to take that question. I actually don't know the answer. Maybe Kim, you do, about signal timing adjusted to 25 miles per hour. I know we are going through Manhattan and retiming signals, but I will say express buses normally, no bus typically moves at over 25 miles an hour because they are making stops. So it's really hard to achieve that on a long stretch of the corridor typically.
So I don't think any of us on the call right now have knowledge of plans for signal timing changes to for 25 miles per hour in this corridor, but we can certainly take that back and get back to you.
Okay, thank you. Next question is related to secure bike parking. Do you have any current plans for secure bike parking on the corridor?
Sean, you're muted.
You're muted, Sean.
Haha, sorry, thank you, everyone. I think that's something we can certainly look into. I think right now we are trying to get through a lot of the early planning stages, meeting with the CAB, making sure that the cross sections that we're working towards make sense. And I think some of those finer amenities can come, a little later in this process, but I think could be included in this plan.
And just to note that generally we have gotten a lot of requests for increased bike parking as buildings anticipate folks coming back to work on bike. So we are working on expanding our bike parking around Midtown Manhattan in general.
The next question is related to the camera enforcement of the busway. What form of camera enforcement will be implemented to ensure a private car does not block the buses? I think here the question would be, is there any meaningful distinction between the enforcement on this corridor and the type of enforcement being done on 14th Street?
I will say that we have added some camera enforcement on Fifth Avenue already, and we will be looking to do more if we think that that is a particular issue or concern. I mean, as you should know, pickups and drop-offs are allowed in the bus lane. So it is always possible for people to access the curb, and that is legal activity. But if people are parked there for longer than, or making the incorrect turns off the corridor or driving in the bus lane, we would issue violations for that.
Okay, thank you. There are quite a few blockages in the existing bus lanes by NYPD and other groups. I guess this is related. Are there other ideas on how to deal with that issue and what can be implemented?
We continue to work closely with NYPD, and I don't know that that's been a huge issue for us on Fifth Avenue, but if there are specific locations, I'm always glad to hear what those are, and we can look into that.
Yeah, and of course, as we develop the plans for bus priority on Fifth Avenue, we're having conversations with PD, so we can discuss that as well with them.
Okay, thank you. For the we're trying to go efficiently through these questions, and we're down to the final 20 or so. Does the DOT weigh the concerns of 100,000 daily bus riders, everyday bus riders, at the same level as community board members and or wealthier private vehicle riders? Doesn't the data speak for itself that this should be done? I don't know if you want to speak to that, but I suspect DOT doesn't actually know whether or not community board members are in a vehicle when they're analyzing how fast the vehicle is going.
I'll just add, and thanks for that question. I'll just add that we are really looking to how we can make this street work best for everyone and most fairly for everyone. 110,000 bus riders a day is a huge number of people that come to Fifth Avenue from all over the city, working in all kinds of jobs. And, we are trying to make their commutes as easy as possible, encourage people to take public transportation. But we also know that people need to get to all of their businesses via FHV. Cycling has increased tremendously. There's a huge pedestrian need along this corridor. So this Complete Streets proposal is really trying to balance out all of the needs of the corridor in the best way possible to make it work for everyone.
Thanks. The next question is, I think it relates to something that's been addressed already, but why did COVID cause delays in implementation rather than the reverse? I think it's been spoken to. I'll let you speak to it again. if you'd like to, but I think the question is why not faster?
Sure. I mean, the general answer is that we did not have our crews out working at the peak of COVID for safety reasons as the primary reason. So whereas normally we are able to kind of have our implementation season up and running in by May, we started a lot later this year. Our staffing just hasn't been the same.
Yep, thank you. The next question is whether or not there's data on the demographics of current ridership. Is that demographic data available from DOT or MTA?
Chelsea, do we have I'm not sure that we don't necessarily have a demographic makeup of riders. I don't know if anyone from MTA can speak to that. We don't collect that data. That data is not typically collected.
Okay.
We know how many people commute, citywide based on just census data and how they commute, but
Yep. Okay. Thank you. There are some questions that don't seem specific enough or different enough from previous questions that I'm going to have to just bypass at this point. Next question is related to pedestrian barricades. Will the pedestrian barricades on the west side be removed? From Christine Bertet. I assume that means the west side of Fifth Avenue.
Hi, Christine. Hi, everyone. Good evening. It's Jennifer Santinez from DOT. That's something that I think we're still taking a look at with our other pedestrian team, as well as the bike team and the busway team that's on now. So, Christine, we can get back to you and confirm with folks once we speak with our colleagues on that one.
Christine also asks, the west side sidewalk is the most congested by far. Why not install the sidewalk extension on that side?
I'll say because the bus lanes are located there, and in order to maintain ADA accessibility for bus customers, they need to be able to pull all the way to the curb, an actual curb.
David Kalis asks why, when safety is such an issue, has not one word been said about enforcing existing bicycle laws as bicyclists get more out of control every day? Who is responsible for keeping bicyclists in line? Surely that's not a police job. Do you want to address whose job it is?
So we're hoping that this design will organize the street, put cyclists in a space where pedestrians and cyclists and motorists expect them to be. And again, as I touched on earlier, improving the interaction between bikes and pedestrians, bikes and vehicles, bikes and buses. I think that's our overarching goal, is to by organizing the street, creating a space for everyone and improving those interactions. In terms of enforcement, that does fall on NYPD.
And just to reiterate, this is something that comes up every time we present protected bike lane projects. But just as a reminder, when we implement those kinds of projects, we see safety benefits for everyone on the street. So when we're talking about safety, implementing a project like this, we do see as a benefit for pedestrians and cyclists and even motorists.
Thank you. The next question is, do you have any data on express bus speeds? I think this is relative again to in express busways. What are the speeds that the express buses are reaching?
Does anyone from MTA want to address that question?
We could try and get you that data. I don't have it offhand for this presentation, but we can certainly report back on that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that might be useful information to have when you folks return to us. down the last dozen or so. Next question, are pickup times factored into measuring the bus speed? If so, have we considered other reasons for the increased bus speed, such as the fact that there are fewer riders, so not all stops are made, and no time spent inserting Metro cards upon boarding? Plus no tourism, so most riders understand the bus system, increasing hop-on time. So I think it's relative to reasons for bus speed increases and whether or not you're able to address bus speed increases on busways to specific factors.
Hi, sorry. It sounds like we have a lot to report back to you on bus speeds at the next meeting, and certainly we can gather all that data for you and report back, but I don't want to speak to anything right now without the data in front of me.
Okay.
I will say that we do know that the question's gone now, so I can't remember all the details, but we do include stops in the bus speeds. They're end to end, including all criteria. And, you know, we can come, like Laura said, we have there's additional data they can come back with, but of course, all of those things contribute to buses moving faster. Certainly a whole lot less traffic on Fifth Avenue has contributed to buses moving faster. And so that's all part of the equation.
And I'll just put a plug and say, end of the month, we're going to start collecting fares on buses again. So if there is any impact from that, we will see that in the coming months.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. A question on a smaller scale, comparing to when the plan was presented to limit traffic on Broadway between 26th and 27th, many residents resisted. Since the change was made on Broadway, have there been any complaints that DOT has received? I assume the question is related to residents. Do residents continue to contact you relative to Broadway between 26 and 27?
Sure, happy to speak to that. Generally, after the projects are implemented, complaints from residents and other stakeholders typically die down. So I'm not sure if the questioner had a specific area in mind, but feel free to contact the Manhattan office and we can continue to discuss that.
Great, thank you. There have been no new questions added in the last 10 minutes, so we're just going to take these final 10 and then wrap up this section of the meeting. Next question from Joseph Bauman. Your presentation says the pilot will run through spring/summer 2021. Is a more permanent bus lane planned before then?
Not sure I understand the question specifically. So the bus lanes are currently in place, and the pilot would be the addition of restrictions on through traffic or turn movements and that sort of thing. And so it's a pilot. There's no plan for permanent restrictions at this point. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Yep, I'm not sure either. And I'm not. The question may have also been. Obviously, it's a pilot, but whether or not current plans are for making the busway permanent after next spring, summer, when the pilot is planned to end. And I guess the implication is as the 14th Street busway was made permanent.
Right. So at this point, our plan is to do a pilot for 12 months.
Yep. Thank you. Question related to the busway. If you have to pick up a cab, how do you cross the bike, or no, I'm sorry, I guess it's related to the bike lane. If you have to pick up a cab, how do you cross the bike lane and the pedestrian lane without fear of being knocked over, especially if you are elderly or disabled, and especially with the advent of electric bikes?
So at the corners, there will be painted pedestrian areas. So at the corners, you can just access the painted pedestrian area and catch a cab. It would be, 8+3, so 11 feet wide. If you were mid-block, you would cross the 6-foot bike lane, and there would be a 3-foot buffer and 8-foot parking space. So then you'd be able to step out of the bike lane, wait in that 3-foot buffer area, and wait for a livery cab to pull in.
But just to clarify, if you didn't want to cross a potentially active bike lane, you could cross at the at the crosswalk while traffic was stopped? Is that the?
Correct. There's crosswalks at both corners. Yes, both ends.
And again, just for the, as I announced, I think we're going to cut it off at the at questions that were submitted before 7:15, as I announced just a couple of minutes ago. Just wondering why bikes and the pedestrian part of the plan has been severed from the entire plan and around the work that the cab is doing. It makes the cab members' work irrelevant since they have been evaluating this complete street plan in its entirety and not in sections. I'm not sure I'm under, oh, and it disappeared. I'm not sure I'm understanding it entirely. I think the question is, why is the cab separated from the rest of the complete street proposal? Why is the cab is evaluating separated from the rest of the complete street proposal?
So I think one of the challenges here is that we're looking to install a bike lane, be it temporary or permanent, and some pedestrian space this fall. We do have timing challenges there. We can't put in paint after a certain temperature. And so I think in general, while we still are looking at the corridor holistically, and we still are looking for cab input, and we'll still have more cab meetings before the bike lane is fully installed. I think we're just trying to move forward with the request for the complete streets improvements at this point while we work through some of the other concerns we've heard and try to just come up with the best plan for the bus as well. Feel free to add anything to that, DOT.
Okay, thanks. Next question is, how will adding these painted lanes affect the Black Lives Matter mural currently painted on Fifth Avenue? Will the mural be repainted?
My understanding that the Black Lives Matter mural will not be repainted after the project gets implemented. That was a one-time initiative from the mayor's office to have BLM, street murals painted across the city. So I'm not sure, Janet, if you have anything else to add, but just to answer that question, I don't believe it will be replaced.
I guess I read the question, I heard it a little differently, is will we be painting over it with the bike and pedestrian space? And we'll just have to, we haven't looked at the detailed design yet for that block, but obviously we'll deal with that really sensitively and consider, but like Jennifer said, the mural itself would not be repainted. That's our understanding.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you. The next question, can you reconfirm the measurements discussed for the bike treatments? I don't know if you want to go over them again or if they're going to be in the presentation that we're going to make available on the website, the presentation that we just saw. I think that would be sufficient for anyone who wants to revisit that. There it is on the screen.
Sure, and also just as always, our designs are always subject to, final engineering review as we move forward towards implementation. So just take that with, just recognizing that things can shift a little bit in the process.
If I'm understanding the next question by Christine correctly, if there's not parking protecting the protected bike lane, will there be any kind of vertical grade change to protect the bike lane from traffic?
In the spaces where the parking drops, we would likely add delineators. That would be the vertical element in that space.
Okay, thank you. Next question, doesn't making every car turn at the first intersection create more of a safety hazard? Can you speak very briefly at a high level about the principle behind that?
The principle behind that would be that there would be many fewer vehicles on the corridor in general, that only vehicles that actually had business on Fifth Avenue would typically come to Fifth Avenue. So by having cars having to turn at the next intersection, we would expect that those numbers would still be lower than they were pre-COVID.
Thank you. Next to last question. Where does the question of off hours through travel stand in terms of DOT plans or the cab discussions at this point?
The current bus lanes are in effect 24 hours a day. For any other traffic restrictions that we might employ here, we're still examining that, and that's part of what we'll bring back to the cab and to the CB.
Final question. If there will be poles and cameras and signage added all along Fifth Avenue, what does that mean for the community board's established priority of clear visual corridors? I don't know if DOT wants to speak to visual corridors in general. From a community board perspective, we certainly prioritize clear visual corridors, particularly on uptown avenues like Fifth Avenue. But I don't, Sam, maybe you can correct me if this is wrong, but I don't believe we have specific finite criteria delineated for that the way we do for some other things like bus locations and other types of criteria. But DOT, do you want to speak to clear visual corridors like looking up Fifth Avenue?
So we're very familiar. Go ahead, Kim.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to add and say that, you know, EJ, we're very familiar with the board's preference and priorities for clear visual corridors, you know, in terms of how many poles and signs and, you know, equipment will be added to each block. That's something that we're still working on. I know, Fred, we can continue to, you know, get you more clarification on that. Not sure if my DOT colleagues wanted to add a bit more, but we'll certainly keep everybody posted.
Yep, thank you. I think the hope there is that Manhattan Henge does not get ruined by too many cameras getting added to Fifth Avenue. Okay, those are the questions that were submitted by the members of the public. I want to thank DOT for indulging all those questions, just as you would in a public meeting with members of the public. I want to thank members of the public for rolling with this new process as we try it out, and for deferring to our attempts to do it efficiently and to combine questions and to go through them as efficiently as possible. And I apologize that you had to hear my voice a lot more frequently than normal, where you would have gotten to hear directly from members of the public. This is the first time in the age of COVID that we've had a public committee meeting with quite so many attendees. We'll continue to try to do better and improve on this process as well. But with that, we'll wrap up this agenda item talking about Fifth Avenue. Thanks again to DOT, and thanks again to all the members of the public who participated in it. With that, we'll go to what I believe should be much briefer sections of our meeting. The next agenda item is updates on the 14th Street Busway. DOT, we sent a couple questions along in advance. Not sure if you want to speak at all to those questions and whether or not you had any thoughts on addressing them and some of the data that we had talked about in the past in terms of continuing to assess 14th Street.
Sure, I think Janet was gonna take a stab at answering some of those questions and her team.
I think there were just a few questions about the busway, and so just to speak generally, as you may know, DOT through the consultant Sam Schwartz Engineering released 2 monitoring reports about the busway, each which showed really positive results for the busway pilot. Those are available on Sam Schwartz's website, publicly available. And in June, the mayor subsequently declared the project permanent. but that doesn't change our commitment to making sure that we're identifying any other issues, just like we do on all of our bus projects citywide, and addressing and talking with community stakeholders about what is going on with the project. The first question we received was, what kind of outreach to storefronts and residents have we conducted, and are there any trends in the feedback? In the second report, we worked with Sam Schwartz Engineering to field a really comprehensive survey of businesses, residents, and users of 14th Street from last winter, which was featured in the second monitoring report. So if you look at that report, you can get some of the feedback that we saw come out of that. A total of almost 1,700 public responses were obtained, with 183 business responses, which is really pretty high response rates. The trends can really be seen in the report, but it's important to note the survey took place before the pandemic and the lockdown, which really changed traffic patterns since then. And, you know, obviously business conditions and residential occupancy along the corridor and all that.
Can you speak to what, and I guess I might be asking you to think back to pre-COVID, like February and March. Can you speak to whether or not you were seeing or learning of any business impacts on the businesses that were on the corridor, and whether or not any of the initial fears of decreased foot traffic and decreased car traffic to businesses ended up being borne out?
I would have to read from the report. I don't know all that information off the top of my head, so I don't have that here.
I mean, I think in the short answer is that we certainly heard some concerns raised about access to their stores for deliveries and other things, but we don't have hard data on the impacts of that on those businesses.
Yeah, the reporting. Yeah, and by hard data, you mean like receipts and income data, maybe, but
or survey data.
Yeah.
From businesses. I know that going door to door was some of the preliminary work that was done by DOT, or Sam Schwartz contacted by DOT before the busway was implemented, and I was wondering whether that kind of survey of businesses on the corridor was done post.
Yeah, it was, and that's what's reflected in the second report that came out in May. And so it shows mixed opinions of how the corridor has worked for some people and not for others. And there's a lot of data in there about the public feedback, and we asked questions like of businesses. I'm reading here, how familiar were you with the project? Some people were still not familiar with the project at all. And I know we did survey some businesses on side streets or on avenues who were just didn't even really know that something had happened on 14th Street, which was interesting to us. And, there are questions about the number of customers visiting the businesses. It looks like the largest response was typically stayed the same. But I don't want to just pick and choose data as I'm talking to you about it. It's really worth going through the survey and the presentation in detail and looking at all of the elements that are in there.
Hi, Janet, it's Rami. I just, in the chat, I gave the link to the Sam Schwartz study, and page 21 has the business feedback that we received. So if folks want to look at that, they can do so if they have any questions.
Thanks. That's helpful, and we'll look forward to digging in particularly into the May report, which I suspect a lot of committee members won't have gotten a chance to may have not even known it existed, and haven't gotten a chance to review it yet. So that is helpful. Knowing that the other questions we sent along in advance were somewhat broad, I think I want at this point to open things up to the committee and see if there are any particular questions. Again, knowing that we still have this we have this May report from Sam Schwartz, the second report that can be studied. Are there any sort of open or lingering questions for members of the committee that they'd like to direct to DOT at this point, perhaps relative to any questions that we might have brought up the last time we were discussing this with them? Feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. Okay, not seeing any. Oh, we got one. Chris Clark.
Hi. Yeah, my question is specifically regarding something that came up when you last presented, or when Sam Schwartz last presented about this. Just hearing some anecdotal evidence back then that certain residents were being ticketed when they were unloading groceries, since it's a no standing zone. I just wanted to check in on that and see if that has continued, if there have been any changes to it. I recognize that enforcement on this stretch might have undergone some pretty significant changes. So please feel free to answer that question, either specifically on the no stopping zone issue, or more broadly as it relates to enforcement more generally.
Thanks for that question. I will say I have not heard in my group complaints about that recently. I don't know if Jennifer or Kimberly,
No,
you have.
We haven't recently, and so we did, having received that question in advance, we did reach out to PD to see if they had any sort of information on that. I think it's a difficult one for them to elaborate on, or to have actual numbers on. So I think we can just share that at this point. We haven't been receiving complaints along those lines at all recently.
That's helpful. Thank you. At this point, in anticipation of going to questions from members of the public in a minute, if you do have a question, please feel free to, if you're a member of the public and you do have a question, please feel free to put it into the Q&A section of Zoom. Right now, if there are any other questions from members of the committee, please feel free to raise your hand. So not seeing any more questions from members of the committee. At this point, we'll take a look at questions from members of the public.
Oh, sorry, I took down your hand. Chris, you had a question?
Yeah, sorry, I thought I had done that on accident. Yeah, I did have another question. I know I sort of alluded to this earlier, and it's okay if you don't have any updates, but would it be possible to speak more broadly to how enforcement is being done on this blocking? You mentioned that you would ask NYPD for the specific numbers regarding the grocery unloading question. I know this is a time where enforcement is being sort of reimagined in a lot of different ways. Are you able to provide any updates as to how DOT is handling enforcement, and whether NYPD will continue to be the sort of enforcement officers in all situations?
Well, on the 14th Street Busway, we have the camera enforcement that is, how we have been enforcing the restrictions specifically related to the busway, so on through movements. And so that's, PD is not at each intersection anymore. They're still along the corridor and still surrounding streets issuing violations, but we do have the camera enforcement in this case, which is the primary means of enforcing the busway.
Got it. That's helpful to know. May I ask a quick follow-up question on that? Yeah. Is it possible to sort of predict into the future how DOT's enforcement collaboration with NYPD is going to change, specifically regarding this project, or more generally, or are you not at a place where you can make that kind of prediction?
I don't think so. That's something that we can comment on at this point. No.
I understand.
Any other questions from members of the committee? All right. With that, we'll go to questions submitted by members of the public. Gail Fox asks, when will a cab for 14th Street ever meet or begin to meet? Many questions asked over the past 3 years are still unanswered. What modifications are planned, and how can local residents submit requested modifications? So I think there's a couple questions there, which I think are very valid given what we've heard, the intention of the Fifth Avenue cab to continue operating in a feedback and iteration sort of way, even after it's theoretically implemented. Is anything equivalent? Is an equivalent community advisory board planned for 14th Street?
So
I
guess
think
I
as you're
can.
all familiar with, there was a, oh, go ahead, Robbie.
Oh, sorry. No. Yeah, I mean, just some background on sort of like why we went with the cab structure for these projects is, we were trying to, we had an aggressive timeline. It lined up with summer, the ability to kind of meet on the board basis, which we normally would have been doing for projects like these, was it was unlikely that we'd be able to work within that structure. And we also felt like we needed a serious commitment to continue to work with folks even after implementation, because we didn't, accepting that maybe we get it down fast and it's not perfect, but we need to keep adjusting along the way. I think for 14th Street, we obviously had there was a lot of conversation before that project launched. They were through the boards, in public meetings. The launch period there was like close to 2 years. And then we've met after implementation with boards, CB5 and the others, whenever requested on a fairly regular basis prior to COVID at least. And we've done a number of walkthroughs. So, and we've been constantly responsive to elected officials and everything else. And then the Sam Schwartz report has provided a lot of the feedback that people were looking for and sort of the monitoring people were looking for. So we didn't, I think the cabs were acknowledgement that we couldn't do that same thing for these projects that we have been doing for 14th Street. And I think that the process that we've had for 14th Street through the boards and other means has been effective, and we're going to continue to take questions from the community through the board process. And I think that that's a good way to do it. And obviously Kimberly and Jennifer can talk about how they are accessible at all times in the Manhattan office.
To the second part of the question, are there, based on the Sam Schwartz reports or any other data or considerations, are there any like currently planned or just potentially anticipated changes to the busway, to the 14th Street busway coming in the foreseeable future?
The answer is yes. We're still looking at those. With the lower traffic volumes throughout the city, we haven't been hearing as many complaints or concerns about the side street traffic. There's a couple of things that we're looking to do, but we don't have immediate plans as of right now.
Okay, thank you. The next question by Jason Gers. Regarding the busway report, are we able to separate any impact of the busway from the simultaneous impact of the L train weekend shutdowns? And it says, for context, thinking about business impacts.
Yeah, we really are not able to separate that.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
Right, clear answer. That is all the questions that I see in the Q&A. Okay, well, thanks very much. I would just reiterate what was said about, for members of the public who still want to engage or still have questions. Did you say it was Jennifer and Kimberly were the correct people to reach out to?
Yeah.
Okay, I would simply encourage members of the public who still have questions or are looking for engagement with DOT. With that, we'll wrap up that item on the agenda. Thank you again to DOT for fielding our questions and members of the public for participating. Finally, and I suppose this may be a brief item as well, we had asked for a very general update on the status of the Open Streets and Restaurant Streets program. Can you let us know how that's going?
Absolutely. Hi, good evening, everyone. It's Jennifer Santinas again. I'm happy to speak to updates for open streets and open restaurants. I just checked the public portal for our open restaurants program. That's at nycopenrestaurants.info. Currently, there are 9,912 participating restaurants in the program. As you know, it launched at the end of June when phase 2 opened for outdoor dining. It has been widely successful since then. And over half of those almost 10,000 restaurants are participating in Manhattan. I know that we've heard from a lot of the different community boards across the whole borough about questions and issues in terms of enforcement and citing criteria. And the Manhattan Borough Commissioner's Office is always happy to field those questions. But I'd say it's going well so far. We've had inspectors go out to all of the participating restaurants that have roadbed setups to ensure that all of those outdoor dining seating areas are meeting our current criteria. So I'm also happy to answer any other questions that the committee or the public may have tonight.
So inspectors have literally visited every restaurant in the program that put seating on the
street, correct.
Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And what we've been doing over the last few weeks too is just reaching out to any new restaurant that qualifies and self-certifies for the program to ensure that they're aware of the citing criteria. All of that information can be found on the DOT Open Restaurants website, which is nyc.gov/open-restaurants if any folks still need that information.
And they're there to check generally all the citing criteria, whether they're not going out into the road too far, whether or not the tables are appropriately spaced. Is that generally what their task is when they visit?
That's correct. So ensuring that the barriers exist on all three sides of the sidewalk, or rather on the roadbed setup adjacent to the sidewalk, ensuring that there's reflective tape on all three sides of those barriers, and just making sure that it meets all of our safety criteria.
Thank you. I'll ask a couple of initial questions based on some notes that members of the committee have pulled together already. And then I'll let members of the public ask any questions that, first members of the committee ask any questions that they might have, and then members of the public can put questions in the Q&A as well. Are there, at this point, to your knowledge, any or lots of reports of damage to the installations that are being put in the street, or cars interacting with or hitting any of the installations that are being put in the street?
So I had mentioned that our inspectors had gone out to visit all participating restaurants with street seating. And for the locations that don't meet those safety requirements, we either issue notices of violation, and we have inspectors that are talking to all of the restaurants and establishments about which part of their setup doesn't meet our requirements, so hopefully they could fix it. Let's say the retroreflective tape isn't in the right place, or the barriers aren't wide enough, or there isn't a ramp for ADA accessibility. All of the safety criteria was actually refined over the first couple of weeks since the program launched to make sure that there aren't to ensure that safety of all of the patrons and all of the New Yorkers that are either, using the establishment or passing by the establishment remain safe. So luckily, we also haven't had many instances of collisions, but I think, there are a few, circumstances and instances that have made the news, but there have been very rare.
Okay, thank you. This might be difficult to assess given seasonality and given COVID, but have you seen any impacts on traffic or increased traffic in areas with closed streets or restaurant streets?
We don't have specific data on that, EJ, but generally traffic volumes right now are lower due to the pandemic. But if there are any questions about certain congested areas, we could take a look. Perhaps the setups are, increasing congestion in very specific areas, but generally speaking, no.
Can you characterize for us at this point? Obviously, COVID started, everything shut down, traffic plummeted. Traffic has come back somewhat since then. Can you characterize those sort of just dots on the graph for us? Like how much of pre-COVID traffic has returned in a top line? Oh, are you getting kicked out of the office?
Motion sensor. Yeah, I'm good.
Oh. Can you characterize for us, maybe just, at top line numbers, what percentage of pre-COVID traffic has, or traffic congestion has returned to the central business district, Manhattan?
Sure, that's a great question, and that's something that I don't have off the top of my head. We've received that question from other folks as well, so I'd like to check in with my colleagues to make sure that we're getting you the right facts and the right details.
That would be great. I would be very interested to get that number. Thank you. With that, I'd like to invite members of the committee to ask questions if you've got them, and I'd like to start with Luke in the board office.
Hi. So one thing that we get complaints about from residents is how scaffolding interacts with sidewalk seating. Can you talk about, what are the requirements for sidewalk seating and scaffolding?
Sure, thanks, Luke. Generally speaking, our main concern is to ensure that there is an 8-foot pedestrian clearance around outdoor dining setups that are on the sidewalk. If I'm not quite sure what the exact situation is for the person that was asking the question, but if that doesn't exist, then unfortunately, that specific location does not meet our criteria.
Okay, thanks.
BJ, has your hand raised?
I have a quick question regarding the open streets for the permit to have the through traffic be, prohibited from Friday to Sunday nights. Some streets apparently, I know that you have to have 8 feet available space for emergency cars, but if you don't have that the restaurant or can make provisions and with the working with the fire department or the police department. Is that true? So that you don't need to have 8 foot of space all the time?
There does have to be an emergency lane maintained at all times for all of the open streets, open restaurants, and the open streets restaurants program. BJ, I think you're speaking specifically about the open streets restaurants initiative that actually fully closes that street from Friday 5 p.m. to Sunday at 11 p.m. Generally speaking, it has to be, like a 12 to 15 foot emergency lane. I'm not quite sure what the specific example is here, but if there are questions or if there's a restaurant owner or restaurant group that's asking, you can connect them with myself and Kimberly and we can take a closer look.
Great, thank you.
Jennifer, just before I go to the next question, can you clarify, obviously there's a couple different types of streets at this point. There are the open streets that were, selected by DOT and announced by the mayor. There are now restaurant streets that have a sponsor, essentially. Can you clarify who's responsible for setting up and taking down the barricades for each of those 2 different types of seats and streets? And for the former, for the open streets, are they all handled by the same same type of people, or does it really depend at this point on the neighborhood and on local community groups and other situations?
Sure. So each location is kind of unique in its own sense. For the Open Streets program, those are, street closures to through traffic unless there's local vehicle access, or local vehicle access is still permitted on open streets. That street closure is typically from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Sometimes the hours are different if there is a community partner that is managing different hours. If there is not a community partner, the local precinct is setting up those barriers to close that street. And so that's our Open Streets program. The Open Restaurants program, if I'm remembering it correctly, right, or the Open Streets Restaurants program, there is a leading entity for that restaurant group. Typically there has to be at least 3 or more restaurants for a block to apply for the Open Streets Restaurants program. And that leading entity and that leading restaurant itself or location has to coordinate for those barriers to be set up for those extended weekend hours. Did I hit all of your questions?
I think you did. Do the open restaurant streets have fixed hours, or are they per site? Do they vary?
So Open Streets Restaurants blocks just have expanded weekend hours. So on Friday, they can operate from 5 p.m. to 11 p.m. And then on Saturdays and Sundays, they can operate from 10 to 11 p.m. And open restaurants, as you know, they're kind of, it's that larger group of participating restaurants for outdoor dining. They can run up to 11 p.m. as well.
Right. Thank you. Okay. Thank you for indulging me. There's a question from Zach.
Thanks, EJ. While this doesn't affect the majority of restaurants, there are some restaurants that are unfortunately located directly in front of fire hydrants, which prevents them from having any sort of outdoor dining. Is there anything being done to help those establishments?
So when we launched the Open Restaurants program a couple of months ago, we really wanted to create a process that was nimble and quick. It kind of happened within a couple of weeks. We were hoping to just help as many New Yorkers and as many restaurants kind of recover as quickly as possible. And as you know, that means that we really can't help everyone. So there are, circumstances where establishments have short frontages that also align with bus stops or moving lanes or fire hydrants. And at the moment, we don't have a mechanism to allow those restaurants to do outdoor dining setup. And hopefully in some situations, they have wide enough sidewalks where they can apply for sidewalk seating, and if not for both.
All right, thanks.
BJ has a question.
I have a specific, and I don't know if this is the forum here for that question, but there are like, streets like 32nd Street in Koreatown. It's a vertical growth. So there's restaurants on the second floor and the third floor. So only the first ground level restaurant has that opportunity to do that open dining outside. So the second and the third restaurants can't operate. So do you know if there's any, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, but is there any kind of provision or something to help those restaurants?
At the moment, BJ, only restaurants that are on the ground floor and that qualify for our siting criteria are allowed to participate in the Open Restaurants and Open Streets Restaurants program.
Thanks.
Any other questions from members of the committee? All right, with that, we will take a look at questions submitted by members of the public. There are 6 currently. Question the first. Will DOT push forward with the Open Broadway proposal that was presented on January 27th? Broadway, like Fifth Avenue, is a significant business thoroughfare that will only become more strained with the return of workers and shoppers. Could plans be discussed for open street sections to be lengthened and preserved throughout the winter to support local businesses, restaurants, and safe bike and foot travel?
I can jump in here. We have we hope to come back to you guys really soon with an update on our plans for Broadway and the bigger Broadway vision and the segments that we want to prioritize for improvements. So we should be in touch about that very soon.
Okay, thank you. Catherine Nessel also asks, have there been discussions for DOT to allow bids to facilitate community events, for example, yoga, along with retail setups on open streets, particularly along major streets like Broadway?
So I know at the moment we don't have a mechanism to allow outdoor retail, but all of our bids have been wonderful community partners, and we certainly are open to just having these discussions and figuring out what other next steps we can take as the city moves towards full recovery.
Okay, thank you. Craig Slutskin asks, while I realize this is more likely in the purview of the Department of Sanitation, have you seen or do you know of an uptick in reported complaints of vermin or pests around streets that have open dining? And if so, what would be the plan to deal with pest control, given cuts by the city?
That's an interesting question. As you would guess, the Borough Commissioner's Office has received a lot of questions and comments about the open restaurants program, but this one, I don't believe we've fielded this question, at least in Manhattan. I can check in with my colleagues to see, but I really do think Department of Sanitation would be your better bet.
All right, thank you. Next question by Janet Liff. Is there a chance that open streets will be extended beyond October 31st?
At the moment, the mayor has, said that the program will end on October 31st and has mentioned that he is interested in seeing something, a little bit smaller scale return next year. But Janet, no, at the moment, there's no discussion about extending it past that date this year.
Craig asks, on the application process, if there are 3 small restaurants on the block and the rest is all residential, and the 3 get together and apply, what outreach to residents is done? Or do the residents get no say or even notification if essentially these 3 restaurants apply for the street to be open?
So during our Open Streets Restaurants application process, we do encourage any applying entities to do that extra outreach to their neighbors. That doesn't really fall on us, nor does it fall on the community board, but we do encourage folks to really think about who else is on the block, what other needs are needed. I'm not sure if Kim or other folks would like to jump in with more details, but I can also
just to add that they have to submit an outreach plan as part of their application. And so typically they are reaching out to residents and to the community board through that process.
Okay, that's helpful. Last 2 questions. Larry Aronson asks, what actions are being taken to curb the worst abuses of the open restaurants program? For example, the world famous Julian Club in the Limelight Church Courtyard on 20th Street and 6th Avenue.
Larry, if you can email Jackie Lazaro and Colleen Chattergoon from our office, we'll take a closer look at this specific site. Jackie, I see you. Can you add your email to the group chat? I'm also happy to do the same because I can't speak to that specific site just off the top.
Just confirming, is that on street or off street? I guess
I think it's on the street. Larry sent us photos today.
Okay.
Yeah, I can forward you those, Larry's email as well.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. And the final question that we have from Jake Johnson. My understanding is that restaurants are given a 24-hour notice followed by a cease and desist, I guess presumably if they're not in compliance. What is the appeal process? And if you receive a cease and desist, can you reapply for the program?
Process, if you receive a CND, can you reapply? So if the CND was received for a violation in terms of setup, let's say that the barriers weren't wide enough. I keep on going back to that because I do want to stress that, the wide barriers increase safety for outdoor seating on the street. Restaurants should be able to rectify that situation, take a photo, send it to us, and reapply for the program. If it's something where they received a CND, if they were operating in the bus lane and they tried to reapply to the program, they're not able to, there's no appeal process for that specific location.
All right. Thanks very much. And with that, I believe that brings a close to our meeting tonight. Thank you very much once again, members of the public who came out and asked questions, and to members of the DOT for indulging us. I know this was a this was particularly because we hadn't gotten a chance to see you in a couple months. This was a very heavy opportunity for you to provide updates to us, and we appreciate you very much engaging with us and the larger community tonight on all these different topics in this time of craziness. So thanks again to everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Talk to you all soon.
Thank you.
That ends our meeting. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you, bye.